Please welcome Gerald Marzorati and Paul Krugman.
Good morning. I thought it would be good to start. I had my economics class 40 years ago was really early in the morning, so and I hardly remember anything from it. So I thought one of the things we're going to sort of do today, Paul, I hope, is have a little. We're going to be talking about food, but also a little primer on economics and the economic perspective on our food system. And then we'll leave a lot of time, I hope, for questions, so you can all go home and say, I got to ask a question of a Nobel Prize-winning economist, and you'll feel like you were at Davos or something. It'd be really great. Yesterday, we were talking a lot about eating. That was the day devoted to actually consuming food. And driving up this morning, I was thinking, well, there's an economic perspective on what an eater is, and in particular, in recent years, a behavioral economic perspective on this. And maybe you could give us a little primer on what behavioral economics is, and then how a behavioral economist would look at somebody who's eating.
Okay, so behavioral economics it's basically economics as if you were talking about real people, which is kind of a strange thing. But we have a textbook economics has the idealized notion of homo economicus, of people who know what they want and are hyper-rational about getting what they want and make rational choices, and it's all for the best, which you could say, well, who cares? But the fact is that's actually infiltrated our culture. Milton Friedman had his famous TV series, Free to Choose. We actually, our baseline assumption in modern America is that people are rational, consumer choice should be entirely unconstrained. Behavioral economics says, well, actually, people are not these hyper-rational calculating machines. You have urges, you have limited capacity to think things through, you have problems of self-control, and so people are not perfectly rational, and they're imperfectly rational in predictable ways. So that's basically what behavioral economics is about, and that maybe this has implications for policy, maybe for the way that markets work. It turns out, actually, that there's a great new book trying to use behavioral economics called Fishing for Fools, with PHs, by George Akerlof and Robert Schiller. Two laureates, as it turns out, but also, in case you don't know, George Akerlof is also happens to be Mr. Janet Yellen. But anyway, and what they do is, their point is, first of all, that behavioral economics, that these deviations from the idealized, perfectly rational consumer are pervasive, and second, that in our system, people out to make a profit exploit these. They know, right? And so and the point is, the book actually starts with a motivating example, and it is Cinnabon. If you've ever been through an airport, there's that smell of sugar and cinnamon, and which is leading you to consume an 880 calorie thing, right? And you are sorry afterwards. But the point is that they explain, and this is absolutely pervasive. So on food, we know. I mean, it's funny. It's actually kind of funny that the notion of consumer choice being always right could be so, can be so universally accepted, when every time we walk past a fast food place, every time we sit down to a meal, every one of us knows that, right? I mean, life for every American, life is either a constant struggle to control your eating, or if it isn't, then it's even worse. I mean, but it's quite something, and food would almost be, I'm thinking about economists, that would be your base case for the importance of behavioral economics. But it's also it's terrifically, it's part of everything around us.
Now, if I were not writing on the opinion pages of the New York Times, but were writing on the opinion pages of a newspaper that I won't name called the Wall Street Journal, they would say that you would be saying that, well, if we don't have that rational choice, then you're going to end up creating a nanny state that is that is telling you what to eat, what to buy, what to consume?
Yeah, so, I mean, there is a, so let me be enough of an orthodox economist to say the usual thing, which is that saying that because markets are imperfect and the answer is government is a little bit, it's the old line, it's you're having a singing contest and you give the prize to the second entrant because you've just heard the first, right? It's not necessarily true that government does it better, but it's not necessarily untrue either. And simply saying, so we have in our culture, government is always is assumed to be a bad actor, and which is as wrong-headed as assuming there's always a good actor. And it's funny is, people, have I taken myself to places where essentially I put myself into a nanny state for a week, go to a resort that only serves healthy food and makes it very hard to avoid exercise. So if people who have sufficient disposable income actually pay to live under a nanny state for a little while, maybe actually having that be part of our system is it's not a stupid thing. So it doesn't have to be that there's an absolute here, but the point is that we operate in modern America. We operate under the baseline assumption that people's individual choices are always right. And yet on this most basic thing, which is eating, we know, every one of us knows from personal experience that isn't true.
Right. We were also talking yesterday about, it came up a number of times, the price of food and the idea that we were good at creating cheap food that often isn't very good for us, and but that good food, healthy food, is often out of reach in a price perspective for a lot of our citizens. So, how does price come about in the sort of purest economic? Why is cheaper food cheap, and why is more expensive food more expensive?
Okay, so I think there's a couple of, and I'm not sure I have this fully sorted out even in my own head. There are a couple of different dimensions here. The way that we produce food for the most part in America is an industrial production process, one that essentially almost does everything we can to take the biology out of it. And that is cheap. That is, if you basically poison all of the pests and slather on fertilizer, that is a way to produce food very cheaply. Now, there are reasons not to be doing that. Healthy eating is actually probably not the first reason that applies. There are lots of other reasons. I was just looking, we talk about externalities in economics. This is even orthodox economics. If you impose costs on other people, and don't pay for those costs, then that is telling you that the market is going to get it wrong. And so the most pervasive, obvious externality is pollution. And what do we know about food production? There's actually, I was looking back, there was a recent paper by Bill Nordhaus, my original mentor, that tried to put a price on, actually it was only air pollution. So it was only air pollution of the kind that has relatively immediate effects. So it doesn't even get into climate change, doesn't get into water pollution. They asked how big are these costs as a share of value added by different sectors of the economy. And the highest cost, even just restricting it to air pollution, turns out to be agriculture. Agriculture does, as a share of value added, the external cost in the form of air pollution are bigger than electricity generation. So the system, and that's not saying that all food production has to do this, but the way we actually do food production has got huge environmental costs. It also has other costs.
Health costs.
Well, let's not even get there yet.
Okay.
But it starts to apply. So antibiotic use. Heavy use of antibiotics, as we know, in meat production, which has the effect of breeding antibiotic-resistant germs, which then end up being a big health problem, not through eating, and so on down the line. It's actually, and by the way, some of this is new, but some of it isn't. If you actually ask when did disease-related consequences of agriculture become an issue? And the answer is basically as soon as human beings domesticated animals. There's a great old book by William McNeill called Plagues and Peoples, which is human history through the lens of epidemics, and basically it's all about domesticated animals. And if you ask why do we have a Eurasian audience here in the New World, the answer is basically that there were more domesticated animals in the Old World, and so when the Spaniards landed on this end, they brought lots of plagues that this side of the Atlantic had not experienced before. So all of these things are in there. Now, the food that also happens to be unhealthy for dietary reasons is produced with this industrial system that has all of these other costs. If we didn't do all of that, it would be more expensive. I'm not sure that good food would be cheaper, but in general, food is cheaper than it should be. Or bad food is way cheaper than it should be, because we're not actually making people pay the costs that are imposed by that system. So I think there is something, even aside from the behavioral economics, the bad choices we make, if we really made someone buying stuff that's produced in our industrial agricultural system pay the cost of the air pollution, of the eutrophication, the runoff from the farms and all of that, it would be a lot more expensive. And probably, I think we can say pretty fairly, certainly organically raised stuff would be no more expensive because it doesn't do all of that. So that's at least part of what's going on.
Okay. You write a lot in your column about red states v. blue states. How do you see the food system in terms of that?
Okay, so actually before we even get to that, let's talk about, in a way it goes back. So we have, people have bad instincts on, all of us have bad instincts on food, and there's a large profit-making sector that does its best to exploit that. That profit-making sector also has lobbyists, it has money, and it has all kinds of things. So it turns out, I was doing a little research for this, there is a fair bit of research out there questioning both the causes and the effects of obesity, right? So we know that there are some researchers who suggest that eating has less to do with obesity in America, and it's really about exercise. And there are other researchers who suggest that obesity isn't really the health hazard that we think, and being somewhat overweight might even be good for you. Who's funding that research? Well, quite a lot of it is, in fact, Coca-Cola. It actually turns out that, so right there, you have an industry that has a stake in having people believe certain. It doesn't necessarily mean that the research is wrong, but you can see right away that there's the usual interest group thing, but this case applied to doing its best to make sure that we eat fattening stuff, because there's more money to be made in selling fattening stuff. And there's got to be a lot of that going on. Then there's a political dimension before we get to Republican versus Democrat, which is, and this is a different story. It's not so much about profit and interest as it is about romanticism and perceptions. We think of farmers as the salt of the earth. We think of every advanced industrialized country has nostalgia for the way it was, and tends to identify somehow farming as being the real, it's deep France is the French farmers. The real America is rural, small-town agricultural America, even though basically it doesn't exist anymore, right? I haven't been able to do an update on this, but I think we really don't even know exactly how many farmers, because there are so few actual farmers who don't have something else going on that it's really hard to keep track of it. We're pretty sure that there are more people playing World of Warcraft than there are farming in America, right? But we still think of that as being the real America, even though it doesn't actually exist anymore. And so we romanticize. It's very hard to take on the food production system. Along with that is the sense that the kind of thing that's going on here is twee, and it's kind of, it's kind of liberal and soft, and of course it's in New York. What do you think? So the downstate New York even. So that's a bias that makes it hard to take on these issues. And then it is, if you look at a map of obesity rates across the United States, and then you look at a map of the last election, for the most part, for the most part, it's the same, right? There is, in fact, a very clear red state, blue state thing. I think a lot of that just has to do with urbanization, with real urbanization. It's actually the case that if you're looking at general lifestyle, being physically active, and that's something you do in Manhattan or San Francisco and not on the farm where you're in a vehicle the whole time. But it also has to do with diet and adds to the whole thing. So yeah, it's hard. I think it may be it's even harder in the United States than in other wealthy countries to have a rational political discussion of these things.
God, that's a bring down, Paul.
Well, I think we
were talking about all that optimism just 5 minutes ago, and I just felt the air go right.
I'm sorry, but yeah, but we are getting. But no, I think I once had a long time ago. I was actually, it's outdated now, but I was actually trying to figure out why traditionally food was so bad in England as compared to France, and part of it was that England went over to industrialized agriculture much sooner. And so France, they were slow enough about moving off the traditional stuff that by the time people started to be conscious of food issues, of good food, they still had some of the old traditions out there to stay with. And in the United States, what happened is, if we still had if we'd retained hardscrabble farmers in Vermont long enough, then we might have had a better attitude. But the trouble is, we shut down all of our agriculture, all of our small-scale traditional agriculture, moved it out to giant industrial farms in the West before we started to think about what was really good and bad. And so, but we slowly. These things are nothing is permanent.
Okay.
So,
all right. So, questions? That was That's,
sorry, that didn't help much, right? Trying.
Yes.
Hi. You started talking about externalities and how important that is in terms of adding costs that aren't absorbed. How do we get those externalities reflected in the prices so people can make more rational choices?
Okay. All right. The classic economist answer is charge people for the damage they're doing. So you have an effluent tax, or you have a licensing system with tradable licenses, so that someone who wants to do this stuff has to buy them. Sometimes you just ban the really destructive practices. So if we were doing, all right. Look, antibiotics, take that one, which is, I'm not sure that we actually even have a monetary cost, but it's clear that you really should not be using medically important antibiotics to help raise livestock. And California just passed very strict regulations on it, and was quite interesting, because not only did they do that, but with hardly any opposition. There was, it was interesting, that was a big change. 5 years ago, there were some attempts to do something about it or talk about it in Congress, and the meat industry sent all these people to testify about how great it is to stuff animals full of antibiotics. But when California was considering this measure, it turned out there was hardly any debate. It had become accepted that this was something you had to do. So that's an example of progress. And to the extent that you're not going to be able to use lots of antibiotics on animals, then animals raised that way are not going to be, meat coming from that source is not going to be way cheaper than meat raised in sustainable ways, so that's going to help. If we could get proper pricing for the side costs of pesticides and excessive use of fertilizer. I should actually mention that a lot of U.S. agriculture, a lot of the stuff we get is actually relies upon way underpriced water. We have a drought in California, which is terrible and has other sources, but if you ask where does the water go, overwhelmingly it's not showers. It is irrigated agriculture, and if California were to have rational pricing of water, that right in itself would make a very big difference.
Yes, sir.
Transparency has been a really great thing for organic. When it began being regulated or labeled, it was $1 billion. Now it's $40 billion. Sustainable seafood, same thing. Now there's certification. It's grown from very little to, 80% of Walmart seafood is now sustainable certified. But there's a lot of areas that transparency is not good. Any suggestions in terms of building a much more transparent food system across all levels?
Okay. I mean, I'm not an expert on this at all. I'm actually not an expert on any of this, but I usually know who to ask. But anyway, so look, transparency is good. Transparency is, and it can help significantly on some things. But come back to the behavioral economics. Most of us, most of the time, are not going to be able to sift through nutrition information about how stuff was raised. If you can give us a simple yes or no, was this raised sustainably, that may help. But it will help in some cases. But I think to rely on people's calculation and goodwill to lead to solve the problems is going too far. It can be helpful. In some cases, it may even go wrong. I haven't seen this double checked, but there's some indication that the requiring the fast food outlets list the calories. In some cases, backfires. Lower income consumers, in some cases, seem to actually look and say, "Oh, I can get 1,100 calories for that little money," and they end up buying it. So transparency labeling, by all means, it's hard to think of any good reason why people should not know what's in their food, but to expect that simply having the information out there and then counting on the goodwill of consumers to make good stuff happen is over-optimistic.
Let's get one more question. Yes, sir.
During the 80s in farming, we lost about a generation of talent. And I know that some economists still say that it was just the less efficient farmers that went out of business because they weren't doing a good job. I've never really thought that was the nature of the business, my experience in it. And I guess my question, when interest rates were going up to 21, 22%, was it deliberate that people knew farmers would go out of business, or was it an unintended consequence?
I will say very much an unintended consequence. What was the Federal Reserve thinking about the impact on farmers? And I can almost guarantee you it wasn't. Just was largely unaware. I don't think that. I mean, it is true that monetary policy has always had disproportionate impacts on the farm sector. That's why William Jennings Bryan was saying, you shall not crucify this country on a cross of gold. But even by the 80s, I can think they just weren't. It's a little bit like, there were a bunch of side consequences of the tight money policy in the early 80s. I mean, it was also the Latin American debt crisis, and that was, I'm sure, looming a much larger in the Fed's mind than what was happening to American farmers. Not really an excuse you should have been thinking about, but it wasn't. I think the problem is basically, the basic problem is that we are so efficient at farming that we just don't need very many farmers. Now, if we weren't, some of the ways we're efficient turn out to be actually false efficiencies because it destroys the environment and produces unhealthy food. And if we undid that, we might have a few more farmers, but we basically, we also have fewer and fewer people in manufacturing because we're awesomely good at manufacturing too. And so we become so I think if your goal is to preserve a large population actually engaged in agriculture, in the end, that's not going to be doable because we're too good at it. But certainly, but to have the farmers we do have doing the right thing, that is something that is certainly achievable with the right policies.
I think we're out of time. I'm sorry. But thank you.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.